What if I told you that wild camels once roamed the American Southwest? That the United States Army actually imported camels from the Middle East to patrol the deserts of Texas and Arizona? This isn't fiction. This is one of the most bizarre and fascinating chapters in American military history. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into the true story of the U.S. Camel Corps, an ambitious 19th century experiment that seemed destined for success, but ended with camels roaming freely across the American frontier for nearly a century. In the 1840s and 1850s, the United States was rapidly expanding westward. Following the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, America had acquired vast territories in the Southwest, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. But there was a serious problem. These lands were dominated by some of the harshest desert terrain on the continent. The U.S. Army faced a logistical nightmare. Traditional horses and mules struggled in the extreme heat and arid conditions. Water sources were scarce, and the rocky, sandy terrain wore down hooves quickly. Soldiers and supplies needed to traverse hundreds of miles of unforgiving landscape, and the military's conventional pack animals simply weren't up to the task. Army officers stationed in the Southwest began sending reports back to Washington describing the challenges they faced. Some had served in Egypt, Algeria, or other parts of the Middle East and North Africa. They had seen firsthand how camels thrived in desert environments. The idea began to take hold. Why not bring camels to America? The driving force behind this audacious plan was Jefferson Davis. Yes, the same man who would later become president of the Confederate States during the Civil War. But in the early 1850s, Davis was serving as Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. Davis was intrigued by the camel proposal. He studied reports from officers like Major Henry Wayne and Lieutenant Edward Fitzgerald Beale, who enthusiastically advocated for the experiment. In 1855, Davis convinced Congress to appropriate $30,000 for the purchase and importation of camels, a substantial sum at the time, equivalent to nearly $1 million today. Major Wayne was dispatched to the Mediterranean and Middle East on a procurement mission. He traveled to Turkey, Egypt, Malta, and Tunisia, studying different breeds and purchasing the finest specimens he could find. In February 1856, the USS Supply set sail from the Mediterranean with an extraordinary cargo, 33 camels of various breeds, including dromedaries from Egypt and Bactrian camels from Turkey. The journey across the Atlantic was challenging. The ship had to be specially modified with padded stalls, and the crew struggled to care for animals they barely understood. The camels arrived in Indianola, Texas, in May 1856. It was a spectacle unlike anything America had ever seen. Crowds gathered to watch as these exotic creatures, some standing over 7 feet tall, were unloaded onto American soil. A second shipment arrived in 1857, bringing the total to around 75 camels. The Army established Camp Verde, about 60 miles northwest of San Antonio, as the headquarters for what became known as the U.S. Camel Corps. They also hired experienced camel handlers, or camel drivers, from the Middle East, including a man named Hadji Ali, whom the Americans nicknamed Hadji Ali, who would become a legendary figure in the Southwest. The initial tests were remarkably successful. Camels demonstrated numerous advantages over traditional pack animals. Camels could travel for days without water, while horses and mules needed frequent hydration. They could go 8 to 10 days without drinking in moderate conditions. A single camel could carry 600 to 800 pounds, nearly double what a mule could manage. Some reports claim they could handle up to 1,200 pounds on short trips. The camel's broad, padded feet were perfectly suited for sandy terrain. They didn't require horseshoes, and they could eat desert vegetation that other animals refused, including thorny plants. In a famous expedition led by Lieutenant Beale in 1857, camels successfully surveyed a wagon road from Fort Defiance in New Mexico to the Colorado River. Beale wrote glowing reports, stating that the camels performed admirably and were far superior to horses or mules. The army used camels for various tasks, carrying supplies, surveying expeditions, mail delivery, and even patrol duties. Soldiers who initially mocked the experiment gradually became believers as they witnessed the camels' capabilities firsthand. Despite their practical advantages, the camels faced significant opposition. Camels have a distinctive, pungent odor that many soldiers found unbearable, especially in close quarters. Camels could be stubborn, ill-tempered, and prone to spitting. They would bite and kick when agitated. Unlike horses, they couldn't be easily intimidated or broken. Camels terrified other animals. Horses and mules would panic at the sight and smell of camels, causing chaos in wagon trains and military convoys. This created serious logistical problems. Most American soldiers and civilians had no experience handling camels. The learning curve was steep, and many simply didn't want to adapt to these strange foreign animals. The U.S. military infrastructure was built around horses and mules. Saddles, equipment, and facilities would need to be redesigned for camels, a costly and time-consuming prospect. Ranchers also complained that camels frightened their livestock. There were reports of stampedes caused by the mere presence of camels near cattle herds. Just as the Camel Corps was gaining momentum, disaster struck. In the form of the American Civil War, which began in 1861. The program's chief advocate, Jefferson Davis, left his position as Secretary of War to become President of the Confederacy. The Army's priorities shifted entirely to the war effort. The camel experiment, once considered innovative and promising, suddenly became irrelevant. Camp Verde was in Texas, which joined the Confederacy. Confederate forces seized some of the camels for their own use, but even they found limited practical application during the war. The camels were scattered, sold off, or simply abandoned. In 1864, the U.S. Army auctioned off most of the remaining camels. Some were sold to circuses and zoos. Others were purchased by mining companies who used them to haul salt or in Nevada and California. But many were simply turned loose into the desert, left to fend for themselves. This is where the story becomes truly remarkable. The released camels didn't just die off. They survived and, in some cases, thrived in the American desert. For decades, reports of wild camel sightings came from across the Southwest. These weren't just rumors or tall tales. Many sightings were well documented. In Arizona, camels were frequently spotted in Arizona's deserts well into the 20th century. The last confirmed wild camel sighting in Arizona was in 1941, nearly 80 years after they were released. In Nevada and California, miners and prospectors regularly reported camel encounters. Some camels were recaptured and put back to work in mining operations. In Texas, wild camels roamed the West Texas desert for years, occasionally raiding farms or startling travelers. The camels became the stuff of legend. There were stories of a fearsome red ghost, a gigantic reddish camel with a skeletal rider strapped to its back, that terrorized Arizona in the 1880s. While the skeleton rider was likely a macabre fabrication or the remains of a long-dead handler, the camel itself was real and was eventually killed in 1893. The legendary camel driver, Hadji Ali, continued to work with camels in Arizona until the 1890s. He even prospected for gold using his camel skills. When he died in 1902, he was buried in Quartzsite, Arizona. A pyramid-shaped monument with a camel on top marks his grave. Today it's a tourist attraction. Looking back, the U.S. Camel Corps had genuine potential. So why didn't it succeed? There was a timing issue. The Civil War's interruption was devastating. Without institutional support and funding, the program couldn't survive. Technology continued to advance. By the 1860s, railroads were rapidly expanding across the West. Trains could move supplies faster and more efficiently than any pack animal, making the camel advantage less critical. There was cultural resistance. Americans simply weren't ready to embrace camels. The learning curve and cultural unfamiliarity proved too great a barrier. Institutional inertia. The military was deeply invested in horse cavalry traditions. Changing an entire system for an exotic alternative required more political will than existed. There was a lack of breeding program. The Army never established a sustainable breeding program. Without a domestic camel population, long-term success was impossible. Interestingly, other countries had better success with similar programs. Australia imported camels in the 19th century for desert exploration and transportation, and they adapted so well that Australia now has the world's largest wild camel population, over 300,000 animals. Today, the U.S. Camel Corps is a footnote in American history, but it's not entirely forgotten. Museums and monuments. Several southwestern museums feature camel exhibits. The monument to Hadji Ali in Quartzsite draws visitors interested in this unique piece of history. It influenced popular culture. The camel experiment has inspired books, documentaries, and even episodes of television shows exploring strange American history. There were lessons learned. The Camel Corps story illustrates how even well-conceived ideas can fail due to timing, cultural factors, and institutional resistance, lessons still relevant to military innovation today. Archaeological evidence exists. Researchers occasionally uncover artifacts from the Camel Corps era, specialized saddles, tethering equipment, and even camel bones in unexpected locations. Some historians argue that if the Civil War hadn't intervened, camels might have become a permanent fixture in the American Southwest, fundamentally changing the region's development and culture. The story of the U.S. Camel Corps is a reminder that history is full of unexpected experiments and what-ifs. For a brief moment, America embraced an audacious idea that might have reshaped the frontier. Though the experiment ultimately failed, it left behind a legacy of wild camels roaming Arizona deserts until the eve of World War II. An image both surreal and undeniably American. The next time you're driving through the Southwest, look out at those vast desert landscapes and imagine a camel silhouetted against the sunset. For nearly a century, that wasn't imagination. It was reality. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of America's strangest military experiments, please like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Let me know in the comments. What other obscure historical events would you like me to cover? See you in the next video.